what was the reality of living in South Africa during the apartheid?
So I'd say the first thing was discovering that you're seen as less than. And that happened for me at age 6, because up until then, for me, I was a kid growing up and, playing hopscotch, doing all the things that kids do. And then the family went to the beach one summer, and it was there that I discovered that South Africa was segregated. You sort of heard it in conversation amongst the grown-ups, but you didn't really know what it meant. So I was about 6 years old. We were playing on the beach. I was playing with my brothers and sisters. And then I remember seeing these pair of shoes, and it's amazing how that is still really strong in my memory. This pair of very shiny black shoes. And as I looked up, as my eyes traveled up, I was looking at a police officer. And he basically said, in Afrikaans, he said, wat doen julle hier, which means, what are you doing here? This is not a beach for you. And pointed us to the sign, and the sign said, whites only. So that was my first encounter with the fact that the country was segregated, that I couldn't go where I wanted to go. So I come from I'm classified as colored, right? So I come from heritage of white grandparents, black grandparents, there's Indian thrown in there, there's a mix. And so that was when I realized, oh my goodness, I didn't understand what was going on. So we were thrown off the beach. We were basically, the 2 police officers approached my parents, the adults, and said, we need to get off the beach. And I remember looking at my father's face, and his jaw was twitching. He was incredibly tense. And I was like, something's wrong here. Now, my father doesn't look like me. He's dark-skinned. He's probably more Indian. So my dad's heritage is strong Indian, and he had a Scottish mother. So there was a mix there, but he was very dark-skinned. And so I remember looking at Dad thinking something's off here, because I've never seen my father so tense, or hadn't up until then. And, the adults just hurried us up, packed us up in the car, and off we drove. And I've always been a curious kid. I was always a curious kid. And so I started hammering them, with questions. What was that all about? Why did they throw us off the beach? And my mother's, trying to tell me to shush. And my father's, driving us home. And we get home and they don't really explain it. My parents didn't explain it immediately. But it was from that moment I realized that there was something different going on in my country. And I think you lose all innocence then. The childhood innocence is lost, because then you notice it everywhere. Once you know about it, once you start seeing the signs everywhere. See, I was young, I was 6 years old, so I hadn't even traveled on the public transport at that stage. But then when I did have to travel on public transport, and all the beaches that I then subsequently went to, and the cinemas, that's where I saw the signs everywhere. So whites were allowed even on the train. So the white carriages were sort of up the front end of the train, and then there would be the carriage for colored people, and then the carriage for black people. And black people are the tribal people of the land, And so that was a very strange reality to confront. But I remember, I always say to people, I felt from that moment that my childhood was lost, because I don't remember feeling carefree again. I felt like I was this young adult in this small child's body, because I started to investigate. And I'm still like that now. Everything that I see in the world, I always want to know how it's working, what makes it tick. And so, but then when you do that as a young child, I started writing a lot of poetry, dark poetry, angry poetry, as I was growing up through my teen years and so on, and asking all the questions. And then I started to want to become involved. The involvement in political activism only happened when I went to high school. So primary school,
no. The beach situation, obviously, seeing your dad so angry and tense, and rightfully so, is obviously an image that sticks in your mind as a child.
Yes, it does.
From the sound of you describing it, you can visually see it still now very clearly.
Yes.
You think we can all agree that the apartheid was wrong. Given the threat of violence that, and I'm going to be clumsy with my language here, so please excuse me if I say something that's I don't mean to offend. But given the threat of violence that blacks had if they were going into white areas, why did your parents decide to go to the beach in a white-only situation? Was it a form of silent protest in regards to we want to go here? Or is that sort of your first
No,
taste
we
of...
actually didn't know that particular beach was a whites-only beach. So we had gone down to visit some friends who lived in an area near an area called Gordon's Bay. And Gordon's Bay used to be one of the very few, I suppose, almost like remote type of beaches and quite open. So we had gone down to this farm to visit our friends and family, and all of us went down to the beach that day. And so we thought that was a safe beach to go to, and hadn't seen the signs, and it was fairly abandoned, actually. There weren't many people on the beach that day, if I recall. And so we just thought, oh, well, this is a good one. Let's stop here and have a picnic and run in the waves and build the sandcastles, whatever it was we were doing. So I think it was, because I remember afterwards them talking about the fact that the adults talking about the fact that they hadn't realized that was a whites-only beach. And so that was the other thing in South Africa. Not every place was marked with a sign. So there were times that you didn't know, you weren't supposed to be there. Similarly, even if you went to some cinemas and things, I became very aware very quickly that I had to always look out for signs. Yeah, but you don't, when you're 6 years old, you're not looking out for signs. And certainly the adults at that particular time, when they went to the beach, they weren't looking out for signs. And I know in some cases there was absolute protest about it. So people would defy the signs, But for the most part, I would say some of the damage that came emotionally and perhaps even psychologically was the fact that most of us accepted that status quo.
Yeah.
We actually accepted what was going on in the country. Now, there would be waves of protest and waves of civil unrest from time to time, but the police force, the armies, always overpowered those protests. So you had, at certain points, there was one of the biggest protests that happened that's well known is when the young children protested the teaching of the Afrikaans language in schools. This was in the Black African schools. And that led to a massacre of young children. Police opened fire and these kids were killed. I mean, it's well known in South African history. It is still marked to this day on the 16th of June. But I remember seeing that as a young kid. I was older. I was probably around, I can't remember the age I was, maybe just before I was going to high school, so the later years of primary school. And that sparked massive violence in the country. That was when there were some of the bigger protests because of this massacre. I think there was over 1,000 kids killed in this protest.
God.
So, this was the kind of thing happening in South Africa. Sometimes the protests would lead to these armed forces coming in, restricted curfews were set. You had to get off the street by a certain time. But then you always had, some young adults, even some teenage kids going up against the police force and, thinking that they could go up against them with stones and sticks. But you can't fight gunfire with, those kind of weapons. So people would, from time to time, go through these waves. But not a lot of the time, we actually accepted the status quo. And what I also noticed...
Because of the threat of violence?
Because of the threat of violence, imprisonment. I know a few people who were imprisoned during that time. Both men and women. Very prominent activists were imprisoned. Some of them were killed in prison. If you ever look at the movie called Cry Freedom, it's the story of Stephen Biko's life, who was one of the most prominent activists during that time of apartheid, and he was murdered in prison, because he was rallying the troops and the people were starting to eventually, I suppose, uprise against the government. But those came in peaks and troughs. And then the most well-known activist is Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years. And he was maybe one of the, at times probably calling for a certain amount of violence, but he was, trying to protest with words, debate, calling for change in the government, seen as a major threat, and imprisoned for 27 years. So
he was incredible. I saw him as a student. I saw him when he came to Melbourne, and he came with Hurricane Carter and spoke.
Yes.
And incredible human.
Yeah, and the thing that one of the biggest lessons I learned from Mandela was the lesson of forgiveness.
Yeah.
But I have to say that didn't come till much later in my life, because when you're going through all of this on a daily basis, I did eventually move into activism myself. So that started happening in high school, would go to all the rallies. I had my first year of university at the University of Cape Town. I hardly attended any lectures. I mean, my parents, to their horror, found out that I wasn't attending class. I was protesting on this, and that is where some of the tear gassing and all of that happened. Every time there was a protest or the university students had their uprise against the government, the police force was sent in, the tear gas was let loose. You were running, stumbling over each other. Sometimes people were shot, killed. A lot of that was going on. I think at the time, when I think back, I was driven probably by adrenaline in a lot of ways, because it's happening around you. You see people falling, you see them being shot, you see them being killed, but you're still doing it. You're still right there in the thick of it. I think that was one of the things that really, my father had been trying to leave the country with his family for a few years prior to that, but that was one of the catalysts, because my brother and I had been caught tear gassed a few times. My brother attended a different university to me. I was at the University of Cape Town, and I think my mother was really struggling with high blood pressure. I mean, just anxiety, like worried, our kid's going to come home alive, because we were stubborn, I suppose. We were ignoring.
Well, I think that there's an element of it's good to be stubborn in that situation. You have to sort of say, hey, this is not right in terms of the world. And there is an element of, if not me, who? If I don't say something, then who? And
correct.
It's the little kid, that 6-year-old, when you lost that innocence on that beach. But what was the reality of being that little 6-year-old and wanting to, were you even, if you wanted to befriend a white kid as an innocent little child, could you? Was that even allowed?
Well, you didn't encounter white people much because sections we were segregated by where we lived as well, right? So I lived in a coloured, different schools,
everything. Right.
So the very first time I encountered white people, I would say, apart from seeing them in the stores or whatever, if you went out shopping or whatever, and you'd see certain people in stores, mixed people, was when I went to high school, because I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, and all the teachers, bar 2 of them, I think, were white. So we had, it was a school run by Catholic nuns. They were mostly from Ireland and Germany, so white people, and then all the teachers were white. So, the history teacher, the maths teacher, whatever, they were all white. I think, our history teacher and our PE teacher was black.
So by that segregation and complete segregation then, the reality is that there's no opportunity for discussion or understanding of someone else's point of view or getting to know a person, regardless of their skin color. Yeah.
No, and then so high school was where I encountered the white teachers. We didn't go to school with white kids. So all the kids in the high school were colored. taught by white teachers. And then the first time I encountered people my age that were white was at university, my very first year in uni.
Right.
And that in itself was a challenge because, you know, UCT was one of the few mixed race universities, probably one of the most prominent universities in South Africa. But my very first class that I went to was French. I was studying French and languages and psychology. And I walked into the French class and I was the only colored student in that class. And immediately I was sitting on my own. Nobody would come and sit near me. So there was white students streaming into the class and I was sitting somewhere, not right up front, but maybe the third row from the front. And I noticed that immediately. And I noticed, people didn't want to engage in that conversation at that time, you know. And there wasn't a lot of protests happening from the white side of it either.